The plane buzzed with low conversation, a sea of voices muffled by the hum of the engines. Corporal Amber Jensen leaned her head against the window, letting her gaze drift over the endless expanse of clouds. She tried to tune out the chatter, but it wasn't easy. How's a woman like her even in the military? The question sliced through the background noise, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. Amber shifted slightly in her seat, but didn't turn. She didn't need to look to know it came from the group of rowdy tourists sitting a few rows back. Another voice chimed in, a thinly veiled mockery. Bet she's pushing papers, not fighting battles. Laughter followed, mingling with the clink of ice in their cocktails. Amber closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. Years in the service had taught her how to handle hostility. Ignoring it was usually best, though the temptation to snap back was always there. A woman across the aisle, older, with kind eyes and a soft expression, leaned forward slightly. "Don't mind them, dear," she said quietly. "Some people don't know how to respect what they don't understand." Amber finally turned, meeting her gaze. She offered a small nod. "Thank you." Her voice was calm, though the tension lingered like static in the air. A sudden jolt rattled the plane, cutting through the laughter and drawing collective gasps from the passengers. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Folks, we're experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The words, though measured, carried an edge that Amber didn't like. She straightened in her seat, her senses sharpening. Another jolt. This one harder, accompanied by the sharp screech of something metallic straining. The lights flickered. A child's cry pierced the cabin, followed by murmurs of alarm. Amber scanned the faces around her. Fear was spreading like wildfire. The intercom returned, the captain's voice taut with urgency. "Brace for impact. We are making an emergency landing." Panic erupted. Passengers fumbled with seatbelts, some crying, others shouting. Amber unbuckled herself, rising quickly, despite the flight attendant's protests. "Everyone listen to me," she shouted over the chaos. Her tone was sharp, commanding. "Stay calm and get into brace positions, heads down, hands on the back of your necks." Kyle, the leader of the mocking tourists, sneered. "Who put you in charge?" Amber locked eyes with him, her voice steady as a rock. "You want to survive this? Do as I say." Her words silenced him, though his face was etched with defiance. The older woman across the aisle nodded at Amber, her voice trembling but firm. "You heard her, everyone. Brace yourselves." Amber moved quickly, securing the boy's loose seatbelt and calming a panicking mother. The seconds stretched endlessly as the ground rushed toward them. The impact was thunderous, a bone-rattling crash that stole the air from their lungs. The cabin screamed with the sound of snapping branches, shattering glass, and grinding metal. Then, silence. When Amber opened her eyes, smoke filled the cabin. The acrid stench of burning fuel clawed at her throat. Groans and sobs replaced the earlier screams. She unbuckled and surveyed the wreckage. Her ribs ached, her head throbbed, but she pushed the pain aside. Survival mattered now. "Is everyone okay?" she called out, her voice hoarse but clear. Kyle staggered toward her, clutching his arm. Blood seeped through his sleeve. His bravado was gone, replaced by a raw, vulnerable fear. "You," he stammered, "you knew what to do. Back there." Amber didn't let him finish. "Sit down. Let me see that arm." He obeyed without protest, his earlier arrogance replaced by a quiet respect he didn't yet know how to voice. The older woman, her face streaked with soot, approached Amber, resting a trembling hand on her shoulder. "You saved lives today, Corporal. Don't think we didn't notice." Amber's expression softened, though her mind was already racing through the next steps. Fuel leaks, injuries, shelter. The battle for survival had only begun. The stench of jet fuel clung to the air, sharp and suffocating. Amber surveyed the crash site, her gaze sweeping over scattered luggage, torn seats and disoriented passengers. Smoke curled from the plane's engines, the faint hiss of leaking fuel audible even over the groans and cries of the injured. "Everyone, move away from the wreckage," Amber shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to put distance between us and the plane now." Some passengers stumbled toward her, their movements sluggish and dazed. Others froze, clinging to their seats as though the wreckage could still offer them safety. Amber approached the captain, who sat slumped against the side of the fuselage, cradling his arm. His eyes were unfocused, his face pale. "Captain," she said firmly, kneeling beside him, "we need to clear the area before the fuel ignites." He blinked up at her, his voice a whisper. I can't. You don't have to. Just tell me what's left in the emergency kit. The captain hesitated before gesturing weakly toward a compartment in the cabin. Amber didn't wait for further instructions. She climbed back into the wreckage, smoke stinging her eyes as she tore open the emergency supplies. Outside, Amber handed a first aid kit to a young woman who appeared steady enough to help. Do what you can for the injured, she instructed. Kyle stood nearby, cradling his bandaged arm. He eyed her warily before speaking, his tone begrudging. You're really taking charge here, aren't you? Amber turned to him, her gaze steady. Someone has to. Do you have a problem with that? He opened his mouth to reply, but the words died on his lips. Finally, he shook his head. No, just wasn't expecting it. I'll take that as a compliment, she said curtly, her focus already shifting to the next task. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the jungle. Amber stood before the group, her presence commanding, despite the exhaustion etched into her features. We've made it through the crash, but now the real fight begins, she said. We need shelter, a signal fire, and a system for rationing supplies. We don't know how long it'll take for rescue teams to find us. A man in a business suit raised his hand, his voice quivering. But they'll come, right? They'll be here soon. Amber met his gaze, her expression softening slightly. They will, but we have to be prepared in case it takes longer than we hope. Murmurs rippled through the group, uncertainty hanging heavy in the humid air. Kyle stepped forward, his usual bravado muted. What do you need me to do? Amber studied him for a moment, surprised but unwilling to show it. We need wood for the fire. Dry if you can find it. Take 2 others with you. He nodded, turning to recruit help. Later, as the first stars appeared in the jungle sky, Amber sat by the fire, stitching a makeshift map into the dirt with a stick. The older woman from the flight, Margaret, as Amber had learned, settled beside her. You carry yourself well, Corporal, Margaret said, her voice warm but tinged with weariness. Amber glanced at her, her expression guarded. It's what I'm trained for. But it's not just training, is it? Margaret pressed gently. You care about these people, even the ones who don't deserve it. Amber hesitated, the weight of the day pressing down on her. They deserve it because they're here. That's enough. Margaret smiled faintly. I think it's more than that. You see the good in them, even when they don't. Amber didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the fire. As the camp settled into an uneasy quiet, Kyle returned with an armful of wood. He dropped it near the fire, then hesitated. Hey, he said awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. About earlier on the plane. Amber looked up, raising an eyebrow. I was out of line. Didn't know what I was talking about, he admitted, his voice low. I'm sorry. Amber stood, brushing dirt from her hands. Prove it by keeping that fire going. We're going to need it. Kyle blinked, then nodded. Yeah, I can do that. Amber watched him for a moment before turning back to the map, her thoughts already on the next challenge. The jungle wasn't going to wait for them to get comfortable. The jungle seemed alive, every shadow twisting into a predator's form in the firelight. Amber stood at the camp's edge, her hand resting on the hilt of a salvaged knife. The oppressive darkness was only broken by the flicker of flames, their light casting fleeting glimpses of the dense vegetation that surrounded them. A muffled sob drew her attention. Near the fire, Margaret tried to soothe the young mother clutching her daughter. Sheh, sweetheart, it's okay, Margaret murmured, though her own voice betrayed doubt. Amber approached, her boots crunching softly on the forest floor. Is something wrong? The woman looked up, her face streaked with tears. She's scared, she whispered, gesturing to the sleeping child in her lap. I'm scared. It's too dark, too wild. Amber knelt, her tone steady. It's normal to feel that way, but fear keeps us sharp. It reminds us to stick together and stay focused. You're doing everything right by staying close to the fire. The mother nodded hesitantly, her grip on her daughter loosening slightly. Margaret caught Amber's eye, offering a small smile of gratitude. A commotion broke the fragile calm. Voices rose near the supply pile. Amber was on her feet instantly, her hand tightening around the knife. What's going on? She demanded as she reached the group. Kyle was there, his face set in a scowl as he stood toe-to-toe with a wiry man in a disheveled suit. Rations are missing, Kyle said, his voice low but sharp. This guy was hovering around the supplies. The man threw up his hands. I didn't take anything. I was just checking what we had left. Amber stepped between them, her gaze hard as steel. Enough. Everyone back off. The group hesitated before retreating to the fire. Amber turned to Kyle and the man, keeping her voice firm but measured. Explain. Kyle crossed his arms. I saw him near the supplies and now food's missing. Coincidence? I swear I didn't touch it, the man protested. Why would I take food? We all need it. Amber studied his face. His fear seemed genuine, but so did Kyle's conviction. She exhaled slowly, her mind working through the possibilities. Let's not waste energy pointing fingers, she said. We'll review the rations together tomorrow. For now, we need to focus on staying safe. Agreed? Kyle hesitated, then nodded. The man muttered something under his breath but didn't argue further. Later that night, Amber sat by the fire, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Kyle approached, sitting down across from her. You handled that well, he said after a moment. Amber didn't look up from the knife she was sharpening. It's not over. Distrust can tear a group apart faster than hunger. Kyle poked at the fire with a stick. You're right. He paused, then sighed. Look, I owe you more than an apology. What I said back on the plane, I didn't mean it. I was just being an idiot. Amber finally met his gaze, her expression unreadable. You were scared. People say all kinds of things when they're scared. Doesn't make it right, Kyle muttered, his voice soft. I'm trying to be better. Amber nodded slowly. Trying is a good start. Keep going. The quiet exchange carried a weight of mutual understanding, a fragile truce forming between them. The jungle sounds grew louder as the fire's embers dimmed. Amber tightened her grip on her knife, her eyes scanning the shadows. The darkness pressed closer, an unwelcome reminder of their isolation. But the fire still burned, and the group huddled together, their collective breath forming a rhythm that countered the chaos outside. Amber took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. She didn't have the luxury of fear. Tomorrow, she whispered to herself, her voice lost in the jungle's cacophony. Tomorrow we survive again. The air was heavy with humidity, each breath thick and labored. The faint glow of the fire barely pushed back the darkness, its embers dwindling after hours of watchful vigilance. Amber stood at the edge of the camp, scanning the shadows for signs of movement. The jungle had grown too quiet a silence that raised the hairs on the back of her neck. Behind her, Kyle approached, his footsteps careful. Can't sleep either. Amber shook her head. Something's off. The jungle doesn't go quiet unless something's out there. Kyle frowned, his eyes darting to the tree line. You think it's an animal? I think it's a problem, Amber replied. She motioned for him to stay close as she stepped back toward the fire. The attack came swift and sudden. A shadow exploded from the undergrowth, a jaguar, sleek and powerful, its eyes glinting in the firelight. Screams erupted as the animal darted into the camp, its snarl cutting through the panic. Amber shouted orders over the chaos. Get to the plane. Move. Passengers scrambled toward the wreckage, their fear a palpable force. Amber grabbed a burning branch from the fire, waving it toward the jaguar. The beast hissed, circling her with deliberate, predatory grace. Kyle emerged beside her, holding a makeshift spear. I've got your back. She didn't have time to argue. Keep it distracted. We need to drive it off. The jaguar lunged, its claws swiping dangerously close. Amber thrust the burning branch forward, the flames dancing in the predator's eyes. Kyle jabbed with the spear, forcing the animal to retreat slightly. You could have run, Amber said through gritted teeth as they held their ground. Kyle smirked, though his knuckles whitened on the spear. And miss a chance to prove I'm not useless. Amber almost laughed, the absurdity of the moment striking her even amidst the danger. Let's survive first, ego later. The jaguar circled again, but before it could strike, the distant thrum of helicopter blades filled the air. The sound froze the animal in place, its ears flattening. Amber turned her head toward the noise, relief washing over her even as her focus remained on the threat before them. They're here, she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Kyle grinned despite the tension. Guess you were right about that signal fire. The jaguar snarled one last time before retreating into the jungle, the noise and light overwhelming its instincts. Amber lowered the burning branch, her arms trembling with exertion. As the helicopters approached, the survivors emerged cautiously from their hiding places. Amber turned to Kyle, her expression softening. You did good out there, she said. Kyle shrugged, though his face betrayed his pride. Guess I owed you that much. Amber nodded, the weight of the last few days heavy in her gaze. We all owe each other. That's how we made it. The survivors stood in a loose group as the rescue team descended, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Amber coordinated the evacuation, her voice steady as she ensured everyone was accounted for. As the last helicopter prepared to lift off, the flight captain approached her. His arm was still in a sling, but his posture was more assured. "I misjudged you," he admitted, his tone sincere. "You saved us." Amber met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "You were doing your best. That's all any of us could do." The captain nodded, his respect clear. "Even so, I'll owe you for the rest of my life." As the helicopter rose above the jungle, Amber allowed herself to lean back against the seat, her body finally relaxing. She watched the canopy recede below them, the dense green fading into the horizon. Margaret, seated beside her, reached over and squeezed her hand. "You're a remarkable woman, Amber." Amber smiled faintly, the first genuine smile in days. "I'm just a soldier." "No," Margaret said gently, "you're a leader." The words lingered in the air as the jungle disappeared from view. For the first time since the crash, Amber allowed herself to believe it. So if you love the story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and comment below. Your interaction helps us grow.